sort of talk about over the next 45 minutes or so, hopefully in a sort of a swift way, is something that a few of my colleagues and I've been thinking about over the last 2 or 3 years. And a key aspect of what I'm going to sort of present today, or try to make a case, is that in most published research, especially in epidemiology, including social epidemiology, which is the field where I come from. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. That the target of inference is often remains undefined and often could also be problematic. What do I mean by target of inference? Here I mean the key focus there that I'm going to focus on is the target of inference individuals or populations. And that's the main thesis that I'm going to be talking about. So let me take a step back to sort of make that case of individual and population. I was reading this book by Todd Rose called The End of Average. It's a book around educational differences and variability in that. But the story I read, which was fascinating, so during the Second World War, a lot of fighter planes were crashing. Turns out, from what I learned from that. And those crashes were not due to mechanical errors or human errors. They spent a lot of time thinking about why these planes were crashing. And finally, the attention turned to the design of the cockpit. If you think about a cockpit, it has a particular size given the plane size. And there are different variables that exist within a cockpit that allows you to fly the plane, the size and shape of the seat, et cetera, distance to the pedals, and so on. And if you think about it, who designed the cockpit? Turns out that the cockpit was designed based on some objective criteria. It was not just engineers who did that. So they took a sample of, I think, about 4,000 pilots from 1926. That was the basis for designing the cockpits for the planes at that time. And they did the average of different measures that they could on the physical features of the pilots. And when these crashes were happening, a study was commissioned to Gilbert Daniels, who started looking at it, what's going on with this? Part of the study was do we need to re-sample from the 1940 cohort, and if something had changed. So this is from the original cohort, so clearly Gilbert started digging in, and these are the variables that had been measured on the physical attributes of the pilots. That's the mean value, standard deviation. And Gilbert defined who can be considered as the average pilot because the cockpit was designed based on the average. The average was not just the mean, but he defined based on the middle 30% of the entire distribution. So that was a range he defined that fell into that average category. And then if I ask you the question, how many individual pilot of those 4,000 that you have fit the average pilot on all 10 measurements? Any guess? Zero. Okay. Basically, the conclusion for that is if you designed a cockpit to fit the average pilot, you pretty much designed to fit nobody. And of course, in this case, it's hugely consequential financially, life-wise, in a variety of ways. You can't do getting your objectives done. Another example that's probably closer to the health field comes from this fascinating book on just the notion of averages by Anna Kradic. And in that book, there is, amongst several things, it's a fascinating book, more of a ethnographic or a sort of epistemological take on the concept of averages. So a clinician, Dr. Dickinson, and a sculptor, Mr. Abram Belsky, decide to sort of engage in this exercise of what might a normal female should look like. Okay. And they did that again based on a measure of, they collected data on various physical attributes of women from 15,000 adult women. And that's how they sculpted, based on that measurements, they sculpted the figure, and the woman was called Norma. be normal. There happened to be a Norman as well, so that's Norman. Apparently, it was a big craze. It was on the Times cover. Everybody wanted to buy the doll. It's like the American Girl of 1940s, whenever it was happening. And then, lo and behold, they had this contest, which was, "Are you Norma? Typical woman search to reward Ohio winner." And that's the form that girls, women had to fill in and send it in. Are you the Norma? So of the 4,000 contestants who were brave enough to send, how many do you think resemble Norma? Zero. So, by the way, they did pick a winner. And that's the winner. And I think at that time it was $100. So that's the closest they came to sort of to what we call average. And of course, a big chunk of this whole field where I'm going with this is that variability amongst humans have often been characterized as basically random error. We tend to describe population along one parameter, the first order of description, which is the mean, or some measure of central tendency. And the second measure is usually the second order description of that distribution is often kind of relegated to something, literally error. I mean, I have students in every year, I ask them, what is that residual? Is that variability or error? Everybody error. Well, it's error if you know exactly what you did and you had full control over it. But often we are just using data on real measurements, real physical measurements, and it's just variability. And I think that error is attributed to Quetelet, who was imported that concept of error from the field of astronomy, turns out. So if you're trying to locate the position of a star, and if there are 10 people who are all asked to guess the position of the star, and you know the true position, turns out that the average of the 10 is a better predictor of the true position rather than any single one of them. And in that instance, of course, it was largely measurement error that was driving. But that has been imported into like all types of things to equate variability with error. And where I want to go in the remaining part of the talk is that it's really not error, it is variability, and some of it, and it could be at the population or individual level. Some of it could be stochastic, some of it random, and some, but if this variation is structured, then it tells us something, and I'm going to sort of show some evidence for that. So that's the sort of the broad theme of the talk. And sort of more in a sort of an academic fashion, I'm sort of broken down my talk into three components. Initially, I'll outline what I mean by population health, what the field considers to be a population health approach. And there are two aspects of that. One, that it rests on this assumption that regardless of if you're comparing different populations or if you're looking at one population over time, the implicit or explicit assumption is that the variance is about the same. So this assumption of uniform change or uniform constant variance. And the second, which is very strong in my own field, social epi, is that to a large extent only population level explanations matter. And I'll make a case from where it's coming from, and is that, should we critique that or should we take another look at it? And when I'm saying population level, for most part, it pretty much means average. Okay, we call it population, but it's really, for most part, when we say population, we are describing the first order of description, which is the average. I'm then going to sort of test the assumption of uniform change and using the example of BMI, as well as whether population explanations are the only explanations, and close with some reflections for future descriptive and explanatory research. So that's sort of the outline for my talk. In order to draw, I don't want to sort of, this is not just Jeffrey Rose, what I'm going to present, but Jeffrey Rose provides a very nice conceptual framework. who crystallized, this is true in any research, but at least in the area of, that I work on, Jeffrey Rose sort of crystallized this idea of population health in a very clear way. And I'm just using that as a way to pretty much describe a lot of the research that happens. And in kind of oversimplifying, Rose, you can spend a decade, and every time I go back to reading that brilliant book, I learned something new. So amazing scholar, very insightful, big idea. And what I'm going to present is basically comes from these sort of 4 papers and summarized somewhat in that book as well. So just as a reference, as a bibliography to where. So this is how Rose defines as a population health approach. And as I said, most all fields, all research is like that. So when we compare different populations, he argues we see a shift in the entire distribution. And within each population, the spread between the 2 extremes is rather similar. He goes on to say, if you want to know why one population has more hypertensives, for example, then research into the peculiarities of the affected individuals will not tell us. Rather, we need to look for those factors which influence the entire population. And this he calls, and this is basically, we want to explain the mean differences in groups rather than the variability within groups. And that's the key sort of way in which he motivates. And he does that based on 2 principal things, and he shows some evidence for it. So first is this notion that he says the population is more or less a cohesive whole. And in this very simple but very compelling graph, on all the 4 scatter plots that you see, the x-axis is the continuous risk factor. So the mean blood pressure, mean sodium intake, mean alcohol, mean body mass index, mean sodium intake. And the y-axis is the right-hand tail that clinicians would say form the high risk. So percent of people who are hypertensive, percent of people who are heavy drinkers, etc. And there was a sort of, at that time, obviously those who were hypertensives or those who were heavy drinkers or those who were overweight were treated as some sort of a deviant, a high-risk group that is different from the entire population. What he said was that just represents the entire population, and he shows that the mean predicts very strongly the tail, making the case that we really need to view not the high risk as a deviant, but as just one continuum that happens to be on the extreme. So that's number 1. He says, that's, and if you believe in that as a cohesive whole, then you could argue that over time, of course, this is not the same population over time, but you can extrapolate, that's what he was trying to do. This is the distribution of blood pressure amongst 2 populations, the Kenyan nomads, so that's the one who are on the left, and the one on the right are the London civil servants from the Whitehall. And what he sort of suggests here is that as populations change, let's say, over a period of time, the Kenyan nomads, in light of the whatever economic growth and progress, et cetera, will behave like London civil servants. The entire distribution is moved to the right. Okay, so this is the idea that populations are a cohesive whole, and when they change together. Okay, so understanding about the middle tells us about everybody, which is the basic take-home message, and we shouldn't treat the ones whom we call as high-risk factors in a sort of a deviant way. Okay, and this is very common practically in all research, where we summarize, population summaries are based on central tendency. And I just put up Lancet there, like now practically every year you get an estimate of GBD, right? Global burden of disease. What's the average blood pressure happening over time? They present it by countries, globally. Previously it used to be every 10 years. Now you get it every year on all risk factors. And they're all based on average trends. And I want to make a point that what I'm talking about as population summaries happens regardless of whether the data itself is collected on individuals or aggregations. That's a different issue. We always focus on averages, regardless of what the data is whether it's aggregated or not. So now, if you want to compare averages across population, it is meaningful, for sure, but it's particularly meaningful only under the circumstances when the variance is uniform or constant. So either it is constant between populations at the same time, at any given time, or within populations over time. What I'm going to now show is that true? It was lo and behold. So I had a colleague, a postdoc who joined us, who's a clinician now in Toronto. Then we were thinking about, we were reading Rose and let's talking brainstorming. And he said, hey, Subbu, has anybody tested this? And we went and looked up, and there's no systematic test of whether the assumption of constant variance is being held, under which case the mean changes are a good descriptor of what's happening. So we started looking at, we first looked at low middle income countries. This comes from the demographic health survey data that I'm sure most of you are familiar. I'm just presenting here, the paper itself has regressions and all more fancy stuff, but just the basic stuff, the basic finding didn't change. So what I have here are 37 countries for which I have observed the BMI amongst a sample of women for multiple time points, okay, at least over 2 points. And on the x-axis, I have the change in the mean BMI for that population. These are countries, and this is the change in the standard deviation. If Rose is right, then there should be no correlation between the two. Seems like there's a pretty systematic correlation between the mean and the standard. So as populations were getting heavier on average, they were also getting more dispersed. They were getting less similar to each other within that population. Then we asked the question, okay, which part of the distribution is really driving this? Like, it could be that both ends are increasing or only one is going, so skew is coming into the distribution. So we looked at what I'm presenting here. We looked just the two extremes just for brevity. So here is a change in the median and change in the 5th percentile. So nothing much happened at the left tail in these low middle income countries. And that can be, we know from all the double burden type of literature, et cetera. So what was happening really was the 95th percentile. That was galloping ahead at a much faster rate. So where today's 95th percentile is way, way ahead than where 10 years ago we were as 95th percentile. So clearly we were underestimating the increases at that right-hand tail and overestimating the increases for BMI at the left-hand tail. Right? So the average was not giving us a clear picture. And we thought, well, this is like low middle income countries, there is a lot of inequality, this is nothing. So we looked at US, which was already pretty heavy by 1992. So we looked at 1993 to 2012. This is BRFSS data. This is very common that everybody knows. Mean BMI has been going up in the US for all groups. By the way, in the paper we looked at by race, ethnicity. In every group you see an increase in dispersion. Standard deviation going up. 5th percentile, no change in the US. 95th percentile. So you had two extremes. So one where the mean BMI in low middle countries is much lower, so you have room, so to speak, to grow, to go to the right tail. But then you take a society which is already the mean is shifted. The mean is almost in 93 for US was 26. Okay, so how far can you go? Well, we can go pretty far. So it continues to increase. England, we then went and looked at that. I said, well, what is it really a pattern here that we're getting at? Standard deviation trend increasing, 5th percentile, flat, 95th percentile going up. And this is a paper in review. Asia seems to be somewhat different. This is the richer parts of Asia. So for women, the average, this is the 5th percentile, seems to be coming down in South Korea. So it's pulling both ways, which is kind of interesting. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and It seems like there could be some cultural explanations to that. For the men, it's increasing or sort of staying more or less flat. And the 95th is also, 95th is increasing for men. For women, that is about staying the same. So this is the only country where still the assumption of constant variance doesn't hold, but which part of the distribution is changing is still very different. It was not the 95th, but the 5th that was getting even lower in Asia. We had reviewers, they said, well, it's not the same people, so we looked at same people, panel data. So in Framingham, same story. So this is the standard deviation in BMI. Those are same individuals over multiple waves, sort of 40-year period. That's the standard deviation in men and women. So again, even in panel data, same individuals followed over time as opposed to repeated cross sections. And this is in Indonesia from the Indonesian Family Life Health Survey. Again, we can treat that data as cross-sectional because they had new cohorts come in every year. Those are the findings which are mirrors the ones before. But if I just select everybody from 1 and just see them through to the end, standard deviation increased by about 40%. Fifth percentile decreased, so moving to the left a little bit. And then the 95th percentile increased by 10. So clearly, in the case of BMI, it seems that the assumption of constant variance is not how populations are behaving. At least that's a reasonable description to say. And in particular, for most part, it seems like this is the story that's going on. That the 95th is, like, with the exception, perhaps in some countries, poor countries, where some women are really deprived, and perhaps Korea, maybe Asia might be a different pattern emerging. And this is true not of the same population over time, but if I take different populations at any given time, at one time, we see the same thing. So if you take BMI, that's the mean BMI for age groups. We know very well that older women have higher BMI, but the variance is systematically, it's structured. Right? It's not all over the place. Variance seems to be increasing. And with education level, if you look at it, again, there is the mean BMI of not much of a gradient in low middle income countries, but variance is again high. So those with higher education have slightly higher BMI, but also very variable. So hard to say that this is a high BMI group because there's much higher variability than what you see for no education group. We are doing a bunch of sort of investigation into all these other things. I just want to flag about other risk factors like cholesterol, hypertension, and blood glucose, which are part of Rose's sort of framework of thinking about risk factors in populations, et cetera. The story is slightly more complicated because of the medications have come in a big way. So in general, what's happened is we are able to hold the right-hand tail, like cholesterol with statins, very effective at holding the right tail. So we are pushing more people there, and then you can stop. BMI is the only one where thus far we don't know any intervention, certainly no drug yet on the market that will keep you at 25 or at a desirable BMI, so to speak. But one thing is very clear. With adult height across countries, we find all the boxes gets filled. There are countries where mean increased, variance stayed same, mean increased, variance increased. All types you get, all the typology. So it's the same thing with child anthropometry. So one thing is very clear that the variance, the assumption of constant or uniform variance does not seem to hold. So what are the implications for going forward? So one is sort of more straightforward for descriptive epidemiology or population health, which is a big component of what epi does. So one could argue that instead of just characterizing populations on did the mean increase or mean did not change or decrease, we can have a typology based on both mean and variance. And in general, that's where most current descriptions are, that mean is increasing in most populations across country. But it's definitely also being accompanied by an increase in variance. What that means is our follow-up question that I'll turn to in a minute. But at the minimum, you need to at least characterize a particular population correctly. And it's hard to characterize as a population only on the means if there's a high variance. It's less meaningful. And Rose, for all his really careful writing, we checked and we double-checked. So he presents this figure in his book or in one of his papers. I think it's the Ansel Keys lecture, where he compares South Japan to East Finland on the cholesterol distribution. And of course, he makes a different point about in the paper itself, but in his characterization, in the Rose's framework, East Finland would be regarded as a sick population, while Japan would not be, because it's the entire distribution to the right. But in this particular instance, it's so clear that the variance is also incredibly different in the two. So for the description that Japan has a mean lower cholesterol is a really good description. And that's not coming from the fact that it is low mean, that's first part of the story, but also tight variance. Everybody in Japan is much more similar, while here it's not, right? So there's that aspect which is sort of, so if you want to even describe cross-sectionally, you can have two variables, you need two variables, two parameters to describe any population, mean and unless the variance is the same. So that's sort of point number one, which I just sort of described. It's for Japan, the means are more meaningful for Japan, but not so much for Finland. And there's a sort of this is a literature that I'm just beginning to read and digest. In sort of ecology and biology, variance is of intrinsic interest. And this is a work by Schmalhausen, who sort of argues that if a population has high variability, that over and above what one typically expects, then that's a sign of a stressed population. Okay, because that's when individual susceptibilities are going, or a variation in individual susceptibilities are going to come to play. So even with very minor changes to the environment, variance can be a target of inference to describe what might be going on in the population. And there's a very classic paper in the early 1980s by Himmelstein and Dick Levins looking at the NHANES data and showing that the low educated groups in the US on a variety of risk factors have a higher variance. Much higher. So somewhat of a test of this theory that a more disadvantaged group, you would find much greater variability because it will sort of, the variance will increase because some will succumb, others will not, to that stressful condition, increasing the variability regardless of the mean. So something to sort of motivate, it's not just error, there are entire fields that conduct systematic scientific investigation on how variances can be important. And also more generally, if you think about it from a global perspective, this is, in this particular paper, they decompose the total global income inequality into a between and within country component. So the basic take-home message is this, that over a period of time, the within country component of inequality, regardless of how you measure it, is going up. So countries are getting less and less similar on the metric of income. And that we know, right? Every time now in most countries, income inequality is growing up within those countries. And if income is correlated with health, which we know it is, causally or not, they are definitely correlated. And you can expect health to perhaps behave. And BMI is an interesting measure of consumption at a physical level, right? Like income is a consumption at the material level. So who knows if BMI is truly mirroring that consumption pattern that's creating that wide inequality in that. Of course, biology will also play a big role in that. Okay, so that's for descriptive research, what type of implications. For explanatory research, it gets into more difficult and more territory. So Rose, as I said, very clearly distinguished that there are two types of question, and he said these are two distinct questions. One question is, why do some individuals get a particular disease compared to others? And the second question is, why do some populations have a higher rates of a particular disease than others? And he made a very sharp distinction between the two, and pretty much in all his writings, he said that this is what we really should be explaining, right? So explaining population level differences should be our primary goal. Okay? And part of that is coming from those assumptions that I talked about before. At the same time, he also sort of said, focusing on this, explaining these differences, okay, is not a very helpful pursuit. Okay. He didn't quite say that, but not useless, but pretty much, he says this is could be. And he had the favorite chart of Rose, the insight was incredible, is this chart. Why he said that, or on the y-axis you have the cholesterol distribution, a major risk factor for coronary heart disease, right? We all know, or we understand that to be a risk factor. And what he shows is a distribution of two populations, one who has the disease, which we know can be predicted by cholesterol, Framingham risk score, and the distribution of population that doesn't have they're identical, right? So there could be people with individuals with very high cholesterol. These days, we are almost here based on our cut point. Every time I go to the doctor's office, I say, oh, okay, we just revised it from 220, it's moved to 200, it keeps going lower. But imagine here, there are individuals with 340 high cholesterol, and that's the distribution that they won't have a coronary heart disease, and that's the one they will, so a little bit difference. And you could be very low cholesterol. So basically the point that Rose had as an insight is that plain and simple, our ability to explain individual differences is pretty pathetic, right? For whatever and I thought, is that really true? Because this sort of really jumped out, because when you look, EPI doesn't report R-squares, you see. We have individual data, but we would never report R-square. R-square, social scientists report all the time, R-square at the country level, 0.8, 0.67, etc. And I often wondered, is that really true? There is very little explanation. So we looked at in the US with the NHANES data, it's a paper under review. So if I asked you to take a guess, if I take all the SES factors as measured in NHANES for BMI, it's right there. So this is over time, but basically what you get is about, of all the variance between individuals on BMI, about 5% is explained if I just throw whatever this literature has suggested as a potential correlate of BMI, 5% at the individual level, okay? And I want to put that in the context of studies that also do, the genetic studies, trying to explain variance, So if you take, depending on the methodology you use in statistical genetics, anywhere from 2 to 7% to almost up to 20%. So basically the point is, even if you take 20% plus add 5, okay, make it 10, 70% is unexplained. Okay, at the individual level. So Rose's insight was spot on with that our ability to explain, and we've been sort of a doctoral student has been doing this thesis. Was pretty depressing. So this is in low middle income countries. So if I look at individual variance in BMI, age adjusted variance, after I throw in these variables, which is pretty much what I can throw more, but these are pretty much giving me the upper bound. Over and above age is pretty much the strongest risk factor. It's 1.6%. Okay. However, Rose was completely right. At the population level, we do much better. So even with these tiny variables, the mean age, mean type of proposed urbanization, mean education, blah, 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 I can explain almost 10% of the country variance, 40% of the between village variance, considering village and country as one realization of population. Right? That's one way I'll come back to that topic of population itself is a modifiable concept. So Rose was right that our ability to explain at the individual level is not very great. At the same time, what we can explain is at the population level, which is the mean explanations. So yes, a lot more explanation, but remember that of all the variance, 77% is at the individual level. So we are explaining there is a lot of variation at the individual level, but terrible at explaining, much less variation at the population level, and we are great at explaining that. Okay, so that pretty much is where, so with that in mind, so just my few concluding sort of thought. So one insight, if that's what the data seems to show, and Rose had this more or less right, the most epidemiological take on this is to follow Rose, which is say we should just ignore individual variability in health, because for most part that's unpredictable, it's stochastic, whatever it is. But that should not deter us from doing things at the population level. That's a separate argument. I can do things at the population level not based on evidence, but based on values. I can do whatever I want at the population level. That's a different discussion, whether we should have taxation, whether we should have whatever it is. But that's different from understanding a scientific phenomena as to why it's happening, right? And explaining that variation. And you get, I'm just summarizing two papers. So one by George Davey Smith, it is one of my favorite papers. So this paper pretty much epitomizes Rose and say, Rose got it right. Mostly, and there are other layers to it. So this is, Winnie has smoked cigarette for 93 years. Why should she quit now? By the way, do you know what's the R-square on smoking and lung cancer? Of every 10 smokers, how many would get lung cancer? About 1 to 2. But at the population level, it can change a lot. So it puts a perspective. That's a risk factor where there is no causal debate has to happen. We know. We don't need any. Mechanistically, we know the effect size are ranging from which populations you look at, can go up to 8-fold, 9-fold. So huge effects. So that's when you sort of, but even there, individual, very hard. And it came into, actually last week again, there was this paper that was published about 2 years ago in Nature showing that most of the cancer is just bad luck. Basically, the strongest predictor of cancer was cell mutation. Okay, 60%, okay. That's why we have Mendelian randomization. That's where Darwin comes from. So yes, so if we believe in that, that's your biggest part of the explanation. So most stories that went out was all the Time magazine, New York, largely due to bad luck. And that paper actually, just last week, the authors published a similar finding now looking at global data, same finding. For most site-specific cancer. They didn't have breast and prostate in that. But so at the individual level, it is very hard to predict who is going to get it. It's very hard. But at the group level, that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And certainly in principle, some can be prevented when you know exactly what causes it. But if you don't even know what causes that, then of course, prevention is literally only in principle. Right? Practice is a whole other level of complication. So let's say, okay, the fact is we can never make of inferences for any individual, so why bother? Okay, so well, that's one, but that doesn't take us very far because, okay, I'll only study things where I find the good answers, right? So that could be one way to look at it. But I think more than that, where I am thinking more, and I would love to talk to any clinician, people who look at people, right? Patients, not epidemiologists who sit in their room, but so they, people come in all shapes, form, variety. So, but when you come to health, it is not an abstract concept, right? So if you call somebody, this is a label, you're hypertensive, it just opens up a chain of other events, and your life becomes different. So it's a very personalized experience thing, which you can't say, oh, I don't really care whether I can help you. And you see that debate now coming out in a big way. Whether in the autism field or in many areas, right? You have to go and you can say, okay, population level, there is no evidence, but you have to ask the parent of the child who's dealing with it. Well, it matters. Point being, you cannot, because it is health, and it's something that people experience. And the key sort of poster child for that is Stephen Jay Gould, who was a biologist who wrote this really nice article. So he was diagnosed for a very fatal cancer in early 80s. And prognosis was 50 days, 60 days. He went on to live for 20 years. And he didn't die, obviously, of that cancer, but could, something else a few years back. So, and his main point really was like, we tend to go with this view, right? All your average time after you get this event, that's what the doctors are telling the patient, right? But for most part, if you take heart attack, that's how it looks like. So these days, we are able to prevent a lot. Most of the deaths are occurring much later after the heart attack. Right? We are able to, but for other types of things, you get this. Most people probably die there, but a few, you don't know. Right? And of course, it's an interesting thing when he talks about this. He's in Boston, he's surrounded by hospitals, the top cancer. So if you include all those priors and you revise that probability of 50-day survival, you probably get a longer survival if there is an experimental drug. If it comes to the market, it's most likely to happen there. And the chances of Stephen Jay Gould getting it is very high. And so on and so forth. So he was saying like it's pretty much the key message here is that the median is not the message if you happen to be the patient, because the variation trumps in terms of the magnitude and significance. Tons of articles have come in the recent times and I was surprised whether you take clinical trials, it's all over the place. The average treatment effect pretty much doesn't work for anybody. So that cockpit evidence, if you designed something for the average, you pretty much, this is apparently a drug with a $6 billion market. Some concoction of this is pretty much used for all types of cancer. We don't even know why it works. So trials, very weak evidence. It's in the market. Some patients say, really, I benefited a lot. Some clinicians vouch for it. Yes, I've had patients for whom it has worked, and others are not at all doing well. So we don't know what's going on. Same thing in obesity. This was an eye-opening article that I came across, which is that half the time you walk into the doctor's office, your blood pressure measurement is wrong. Half the time. And so what Gina Colada does is, so she happens to be an individual who, if you take, depending on the day, she fluctuates a lot. So any mean measurements, even after you wash out the ambulatory versus office, tensions, they're going to take the blood pressure, so it's going to go up type. You wash out all of that, there could be some individuals for whom it's just very variable, and some individuals who are high and steady, and some low and steady, that's clear. But the ones with high variability, so this is for, and we have huge treatments and so on. So the chances of putting someone on treatment would be very high at this point. And we looked at, like, if I take just the group of people whose BMI is over 30, how homogeneous is that group? So this is bringing us social type perspective to that heterogeneity. So these are all monolithically defined as the outcome, right? They are all classified as obese, but they come in, like, at least in, this is like a agnostic cluster analysis at just throwing a bunch of variables that are correlates. And you clearly can't, whether it's a behavioral intervention, you can't be recommending the same thing for the group physically sick but happy elderly. So, you're not going to say, okay, go and exercise for 2 hours. You could probably say that to, I don't know, affluent, younger healthy females, or who knows. But look at the heterogeneity in people whom we classify as obese. This is on sociodemographics. Right? Forget the very fact about mechanisms. So there's a whole field that's moving and just about to be done. So one is we can stay with the chance random world of rows. Why bother? Because that's fine. But whether we like it or not, there is a whole field called personalized medicine, that's also coming, and people do care, and people who are giving money to that happen to have relatives or kids who have some of those events, and then they're motivated to find something about it. So whether it's treatment heterogeneity, i.e. the same exposure has differential effects on different people, or do we need different types of treatment? Who knows? But it could be either of those. But to shy away completely from that discussion, I think, would not be okay for our population. So just a final side, as a sort of a thought that I'm still thinking about. If you really think about health, you cannot ignore the individual, because it is individuals who get sick. Population is truly an abstract concept. The thing that I think I worry about the most with population is it's completely arbitrarily defined. I can change the definition of my populations. My mean will change. My variance can change. I can just alter it anyway. And this speaks also to the point that Angus Deaton talks about, which is whom are we trying to make inferences for? Right? In the RCT world, the external validity is the big elephant in the room. Whom does it apply? We don't know. And I think, like, it's really sort of begs that question of that defining population is a pretty deep exercise. Some is obvious, but other times it's not. And I also don't think that this treatment of, medicine is treatment and public health is prevention is it's an unnecessary distinction. At least when I have looked briefly through, barring smoking, but even there one could argue, mostly we have succeeded in prevention through treatment, whether it's vaccines, ART in HIV, prevention in terms of spreading, right? Now we are thinking about putting giving ART to the partners, the ones who are not affected. Fluoride and e-cigarette, e-vaping, again, if you think about harm reduction, it's a perfect harm reduction. Whether people it's a gateway, that's a separate argument. But it's no question that it's a harm reduction. Or, of course, you can succeed in treatment through not getting there, but doing prevention. I think we are still searching for that. For at least right now, I don't see. My last slide, I'll leave it with this. I love this quote by Galton here. So everybody agrees that Switzerland is far more beautiful than England, right? And it is beautiful partly because it has the mountains, Alps, and gorgeous lakes, deep. If you treat that as the nuisance, that's huge variability, you get the English county, So, where you can play cricket. Anyway, so thank you.